Hi, everyone, and welcome back to our exploration of middle grade literature. This is the third book for our unit, Tangerine, and today we're going to talk a little bit about moving from upper middle grade to young adult literature. We'll look at an overview of the book, we'll talk about some of the features of the book, and then we'll look again at the cognitive and social and emotional needs of children and their developmental milestones and how the book matches and reflects and helps to meet their needs. So let's get started. Tangerine. So in this book, Paul Fisher is in 7th grade when his family moves to Tangerine County, Florida. Muck fires, koi stealing, ospreys, mosquito swarms, daily lightning strikes, and sinkholes. So it is not as pretty as it first appears. Paul feels like an outsider in his family. His mother is kind of preoccupied by the homeowners association, their housing development, and her own social circles. And his father is preoccupied with Eric, Paul's older brother, with Eric's football career, which Paul calls the Eric Fisher football dream. Paul's eyesight was damaged in a mysterious accident when he was 5. They say that he stared into the sun for too long, and as a result of this, he has very thick glasses. So again, like the other two books, and not intentionally, but like the other two books in this unit, we have someone with a physical disability or difference that impairs him sort of, though he seems to have a clearer vision than the rest of his family. So he talks quite a bit about how he sees things that his parents don't, in a metaphorical way, which we'll discuss later. His brother Eric seems to be a nice guy, but Paul sees through that, and he also sees through the snobbishness is the word that I have here. His neighbors in Lake Windsor Downs are kind of snobbish, and they're very concerned with first world problems. He transfers to Tangerine Middle School for various reasons that I don't want to spoil for you. And there he kind of makes the first friends that he's had in his life, the first real friends that he's had. He also takes joy in playing soccer. So basically what happens is that we have a lot of issues here of race and class, because the people who go to Tangerine Middle are predominantly not white or upper class like Paul's previous school. This is the first novel by Edward Bloor. He's published over a dozen novels and chapbooks, so he writes for children and adults, and he writes poetry as well. This is a quote that might be at the beginning of your book, depending on what edition that you have. I won't read the whole thing to you, but Danny DeVito, who at the time this came out, was this when he did Matilda? Well, he had done some movies for children, and here's what he says. I'm going to zoom in here on just this first part. The rites of passage for a 14-year-old boy can be unsettling, frightening, and even dangerous. There's little comfort for him facing challenges that often seem insurmountable, especially when he feels misunderstood by his parents and threatened by his older brother. This is the case with Paul Fisher, the protagonist for Tangerine. Does he grumble in his difficult journey to becoming a young adult? It would be unfair to me to reveal any part of this engrossing story. Why spoil the reader's fun? But I think this first part that Danny DeVito says, unsettling, frightening, and even dangerous. That is how many people experience going through puberty. It seems dangerous. It's unsettling. It can be frightening. They have a lot of changes going on. Sometimes they do have threats from their family or from people at school or from other outside forces. So here's what he says later. The interaction of their individual personalities is what I found compelling, not only as a reader, but as a parent. Eric lurks in the shadows. Paul strives for light. Never has sibling rivalry been portrayed in such an exciting yet menacing way. This is one of the sorry guys. This is one of the reasons that I love this book. I think that what Paul is going through is a great metaphor for the changes that upper middle grade readers of 12, 13, some of the things that they are facing. Here, Paul's a tiny bit older at 14, but I think he's in 8th grade or 7th grade. So a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old, and also that the relationship between Paul and his parents, the relationship between Paul and Eric, as well as the friendships that Paul makes, I think that it's a very engrossing book, and I hope that you guys enjoy it. So let's talk about cognitive development. Just like the Watsons was a crossover between lower and upper middle grade books, to me, this book is kind of a crossover between upper middle grade and young adult books. Here, this picture that I've got here for you guys, Paul looks quite young here. There are other covers where he looks a tiny bit older. And I think that kind of reflects, a publisher not quite knowing who exactly is going to be reading this book. It really is not meant for younger kids. So some of the other books we've talked about, younger kids might be interested in the Watsons Go to Birmingham, though we talked about why that might be controversial in terms of content. If they're interested in history, a younger kid who has ADHD might pick up Joey Pigza. This book has some themes that really probably would not be appropriate for younger readers. Probably. But depending again on how you feel about that. So there are some things similar here to other middle grade texts that we've looked at, like Joey Pigza, family dysfunction, coping with a disability, like the Watsons Go to Birmingham, struggling with friendships. But this book to me has a much darker tone. So is Joey Pigza focusing on problems with home life, with problems with neurological differences of having ADHD? Yeah, but the tone, we talked about, adults think that it's a dark book, kids think that it's funny, right? Much of the Watsons Go to Birmingham is not focused on civil rights. It's focused on the funny adventures of the family. This book, the tone is a lot darker. There might be a tiny bit of humor here, but there is not as much. The themes are more complex. The plot includes flashbacks and sometimes even fragments of flashbacks, a little something that Paul might remember. It would be a little bit difficult for younger readers to follow. So in terms of content, harder for younger readers, but just cognitively, the way that the story is structured, it's structured a lot more like a young adult novel with intricate, round characterization, with a darker tone, with an outcome at the end. Does it have a happy ending? That's something for you guys to decide. I'm not going to exactly spoil it, but I will say it's not the typical happy ending of a younger children's book where everybody works out, everything works out fine and everybody's happy. Which I guess could be said of the other two books in this unit too. So there's more than one plot line. There's several subplots or secondary side stories following various characters through the book. So this is a great way to meet the cognitive needs of kids this age. They're ready to take on things that are more complex, interested in things that have a darker tone and that reflect some of the angst that they might be going through. The story is told from Paul's perspective. Not all of the violence is entirely off page, as was the case with other books for this unit. So things happen to him and in front of him that he is actually seeing and participating in. Now, I will say this, that it is not the same as a young adult book in that some of the things are not, it's not described as, if you had a young adult book, something that was really for older teenagers, some of the violence would be more blood and guts and gore. So off page, we talked about like kind of in a movie, off page in a PG movie, you hear about somebody getting shot, right? In maybe a PG-13 movie, you see somebody being shot, and then you see the smoking gun instead of the dead body. In an R-rated movie, you see somebody being shot and you can see the blood spraying out of them, and then their body hits the floor and then the camera lingers there, right? We're not at that point. We're kind of more in the PG-13 range, which again, developmentally appropriate, right? So, and no one's getting shot. I'm just using that as kind of an example. We have a plot that extends throughout the entire course of the novel. So, again, with subplots and flashbacks and things like that. So, a little bit more complex. And Paul is intelligent. So, we have another contrast here between an older brother and a younger brother. Eric is socially quite popular. His life revolves around football. He's probably not doing that well academically. Paul is quite intelligent, struggles a little bit making friends, but also becomes an athlete, which is something that is a major plot point in the novel. But I don't think that I'm spoiling anything. You can see him right there playing soccer right there on the cover. So, what's interesting is sort of like we see with the Watsons Go to Birmingham, we have a child who has his development and his maturity in sharp contrast to his older brother. So it kind of brings out the unique things that a kid that age would be going through. Emotionally, I think that this book is a lot more emotional than the other ones that we have studied. And again, I would almost include Joey Pigs in that. I think the book about Joey is emotional, but the tone here, a lot darker, a lot more angst. Here we've got a little cartoon that a kid put together kind of depicting some of the events in the story. The emotions are complex, but they're treated with more gravity. Paul grapples with his feelings toward his parents and his brother and his friends and his school situation. There's nothing straightforward. Just like when you're 13 years old, there's nothing straightforward. So he loves his family and in still ways is reliant on them. And just as kids of this age are, he's frustrated with the fact that he's reliant on them. He has to have their support at certain times. He has to get rides from them. Other times he's quite independent. And we see him at one point in a tangerine grove staying overnight and helping out with the farming. His parents seem to not care that he's there, really, for the most part. And he's also angry with them. So other times he kind of feels neglectful. His mother is very much caught up in this materialistic world with the homeowners association and her social circles. His father really cares about his job and Eric's football. And so he is quite neglected and left out much of the time. And we'll see him grappling with these emotions and also trying to translate them cognitively. Kids of this age have sometimes a difficult time expressing their emotions and talking about exactly what they feel and how they feel because what they feel is so complicated. So he kind of matures in that way as well. So that's something to watch for. Paul fears his brother's physical retaliations. And that's another emotional point of the book. His father's favoritism, his mother's kind of willful ignorance. They don't want to see what's going on, and they're kind of ignoring what's happening. So Eric seems to be the root of Paul's problems. This relationship is driving a lot of the conflict, so watch for that person-to-person conflict, but kind of also ask, is Eric Paul's only problem? Paul has a lot of inner turmoil. I don't know if I would call it person versus self conflict. He's he's confused about his emotions. Is he fighting with himself? I don't know. But kind of think about some of the conflict and how you would define it. The person versus person, and maybe a little bit of that person versus self. Social development. There is a larger point being made in this book. Sorry, guys, I had a little technical issue there. So what I wanted to say is that there are some larger points being made in this book about social strata. So there are things that the author is kind of trying to show younger readers about upper class and middle class and lower class, and how people are treated based on race or economic status or disability. And I want you to watch for the evils of the adult world, and then how those prejudices and concerns are passed on to the children and how children grapple with them. Honestly, for a book that's supposedly for kids, this is, there are some really intense themes here. And in some ways, I think a lot of adults can enjoy this book, and even older readers. Just happens to be that the protagonist is in middle school. Paul's self-doubt carries over into other aspects of his life. So watch for places where Paul struggles to make friends. Look for places where he overcomes those struggles and how he develops and matures socially. His physical disability might impact the way in which he's able to socialize, but to be honest, a lot of this is Paul is quite kind and empathetic, and other people have more materialistic concerns. They're a lot more concerned with peer acceptance than Paul is. And in some ways he has self-doubt. In other ways he's quite strong internally and able to see beyond typical middle school problems. So in that way, he's quite a strong character, and not, I think, a really good model for kids who are struggling socially, to kind of say, look, if you are confident in who you are, you don't care as much about what other people think of you. And standing up for people when someone says about a girl who was quite kind to Paul, another student calls her a dog. So being able to stand up for someone in that situation and knowing what to say. These are some things I'd like you to watch for. Watch for where he has self-doubt, and watch for where he has a really good spine and backbone. Paul seems, as I just said, a lot less concerned about social acceptance. His brother is quite the opposite. His brother wants to be popular, but does he have a real emotional connection with his friends? I love this thing from Whisper. All my friends and I think Eric from the book Tangerine is a psychopath. It's an interesting thing to maybe think about. Another thing socially to look at are the two different environments that Paul is placed in. So he is first in one school and then he's moved to another. Watch how he forms and maintains friendships. How does his second school kind of fit his needs better? And how do the changes that he goes through, how do those reflect his personal growth and development? Even with some of these changes, peer relationships are still more important in this book than they have been in previous books. Kenny in the Watsons makes some friends, and there are a few complications there, the way they would be for a 5th or a 6th grader. But here, now that we're in kind of 7th, 8th grade, they become quite a bit more complicated. So close peer relationships, complex friendships, that's something to take a look at. Paul is almost completely independent, and he's able to find friends and mentors outside of his dysfunctional family. One of the themes here, and I believe I talk about this in a minute in the slideshow, so if I do, it's all right. I'm getting ahead of myself. But one of the themes here are older and younger brothers. there are older brothers in this story who are better mentors to Paul than his actual older brother, Eric. So I want you to look and see how he kind of looks at his family, sees the dysfunction there, and then goes to other families or other friends to kind of replace some of those relationships. It's something that a lot of kids are unable to do until they're in their 20s. So it's nice to see that being modeled here in a book for young teens. The book is really rich in symbolism. We have these muck fires, and the book will talk a little bit more about what that is. But a muck fire, as the volunteer firefighter says, muck fires don't go out. They're burning all the time. Sometimes the rain will damp them down, but they're still smoldering. So think about what that might symbolize. What's Paul's muck fire that's always burning? What are the muck fires for Paul's parents, for Eric? Antoine Thomas is another a minor character in the book. This book has a bigger cast of characters than we've seen in previous works. So think about what the muck fires are for those characters. What are they constantly dealing with? At the end of the book, the wind has shifted and the odor and smoke from the muck fire is blowing away from Paul. So think about that as well. How is that symbolic of some of the changes that have taken place in his life? I love this picture here that drawn by a kid who liked the book of something toward the end of the novel. Other symbols to look for, the osprey taking the koi fish. Osprey are birds of prey, so how is that maybe symbolic of a character in the story or just an event? Lightning storms are happening periodically. Sinkholes, how are those things also symbolic? And then the two sports that are featured in the novel, Paul is playing soccer, Eric is playing football. Eric's position on the team is that of kicker, so think about what that kind of symbolizes in terms of his personality and his character development. Paul is playing soccer, and he is often goalie. So again, what might that symbolize? If you play those sports, how are they different? The teamwork on a football team versus the teamwork on a soccer team, and how players interact with each other. So those are some things I'd like you to watch for as the book progresses. And also, sorry, just to jump back a second, children of this age, young teens, as I mentioned before, they really can think abstractly, whereas younger kids can't. So I think this is a really nice book to kind of introduce them to symbolism. But again, if you're reading this as an older teen or as an adult, it's really, man, it is jam-packed. I didn't even list all of the symbols that I kind of picked up on as I read. I think it's really masterfully done. Themes and motifs. A motif is a repeating element. So a symbol that repeats more than once could be a motif. Another motif might be the fact that there are several soccer games, so that's a repeating element. But one of the primary motifs in this book is that of sight and blindness. So Paul has a physical problem with his sight. He can see, metaphorically speaking, more than his parents. So their blindness and their ignorance are repeatedly exposed through this book, beginning with the osprey and the koi fish, or I guess that would be one incident. The muck fires that are taking place. His father bought this house really without seeing it. His mother was really excited to move, and they don't really see some of the problems that are going on in their neighborhood. Another motif, as I mentioned before, older brothers. Eric, Luis, Mike, and Antoine are all older brothers. So there are some good older brothers and there are some not so great older brothers. I want you to watch for this pattern. How do the older brothers interact with the younger siblings? Luis, Mike, and Eric all have younger brothers. I think Luis has younger brothers and sisters. Antoine has a younger sister. So think about the dynamics between the older and the younger siblings. Who is a mentor? Who is a leader? Who makes sacrifices for the family? Is it the younger sibling or the older sibling? Typically, you would think it would be the older, but that's not always the case, and not just with Paul. So really watch for that as a theme. Family dynamics. Family is still important to kids at this age, even though they're kind of striving for pure relationships. Family dysfunction. Creating a group of friends who replace your family. Overcoming odds to be successful. Those are some of the major themes in this book. And growing and maturing and moving from childhood into being a teen. As I mentioned previously, class and race, the way that parents pass their sins or their problems and even their successes to children. Yeah, I said that already. Sorry. I repeated there the point about older and younger brothers. Legacy and traditions between siblings as well as parents. So those are some of the things that I would really like you to look for. A lot of themes here, a lot of symbolism, more so than the other books we've looked at so far, which even though they have complex characterization, are a tad bit more straightforward. So here is an excerpt. This is his mom looking at the muck fire. So this young man says, right out there, it's just the muck fire. She at first was about to call the fire department. It's the what? Muck fire, ma'am. That field probably got hit by lightning last night. Stirred up the muck fire. Last night? So how long is this fire going to burn? The young man laughed out loud and threw up his hands. Well, it's been burning for as long as I can remember. Mom and I shook our heads dumbly. Wayne continued. That field's full of lignite. Lignite is like one step before coal, and there's hundreds of miles of it down there. Mom turned to me with a look of pure puzzlement. Well, I'm sure your father was never told about any of this. I'm sure the Homeowners Association will want to know about this. Oh, they know about it, ma'am. Lots of people call us when they first move here, and we wind up having to explain it to them. I watched Mom struggling to understand this. You explain it to them? Yes, ma'am. And then they do what? The young man laughed again. Well, they learn to live with it, I guess. When the wind's up like this, they gotta stay inside, keep the windows closed. You're saying that there's no way of stopping this fire? He shook his head. Late summer like this, if you want to stop the muck fire, you got to stop the lightning from striking. They ain't figured out how to do that yet. Watching this, I suddenly had to admire this Wayne fellow. He was relentlessly cheerful, even in the face of Mom's rising anger. I knew she wanted to grab him by the ear and march him down to that field and put out the muck fire once and for all. But she couldn't. She couldn't do anything except turn to me once again and vow to bring this, quote, muck fire situation to the attention of the Homeowners Association. So I picked this because it's the explanation for the muck fires, which I've been talking about a bit. I'll show you a picture of one in just a second. But the idea that someone else has to explain it to them, that she is sure that the Homeowners Association could take care of the problem, which is like a natural disaster. It's like telling somebody from a Homeowners Association to, stop a hurricane or something. If you don't know, a Homeowners Association, we don't have them as much up north as they do down in Florida. My parents, though, live in a place that has one. Basically, they govern over the rules for a neighborhood. So they might say your grass can only be so long before you have to cut it, or the houses on this block can only be, these 4 or 5 different colors. The one that my parents have talks about they get together money for there's a community pool, so the homeowners' fees go to maintaining the pool and stuff like that. Sometimes they do events as well. So she's involved in an organization like this and thinks that they can fix a muck fire situation. And you can see Paul observing all of this and admiring the fact that this guy is telling the truth and being cheerful about it, even though his mother is being irritated. So a teenager kind of watching his mom's emotions, and he might react differently, but he admires the fact that this guy is kind of steadfast. So I forgot to put a picture of the muck fire into the presentation. Here's a muck fire that is still kind of burning and smoldering. You can see at times, if I'm going up here in Google Images, here's one. Bug fires Tangerine. So somebody wanted a picture to kind of illustrate it. This one is one that is actively burning. The one in Tangerine seems to possibly be like this and maybe a little bit farther away, not actually in the development the way that this one is. And then at other times, it'll just kind of still be smoldering along like this. So a little bit of smoke, a little bit, but not as much, the full conflagration with the fire. But that is what it looks like. It's a swampy piece of land. And in certain places, this has happened. You can see as I'm scrolling here, there have been places where muck fires basically will not go out and everybody has to move. And hopefully they get money from their insurance. So let's take a look just at the last little bit. Things that I would like you to consider as you read. The ways in which the book moves from a place of maturity and readies readers for darker themes of adult novels. So the themes that I just discussed, the motifs that I talked about, the symbols, all of those are a way to help readers develop cognitively, understand abstract thinking. Same thing with the complex plot, right? A lot of subplots going on here and several flashback scenes as well. So the symbolism, as I discussed, how do weather and natural events reflect Paul's life and his inner life? The messages the author has for readers about social acceptance, racism, and classism. Think about how he might be encouraging middle schoolers to move beyond their circumstances, treating people with dignity and respect, kindness, and building that empathy. So again, helping kids to develop emotionally. And the plot and characterization. I mentioned the plot being complex, so is the characterization. How are those different to some of the other books we've read so far, and how are they similar? So there we go. That is it for today. In our next unit, we're going to be moving from this book right on over into YA. And in our next lecture, I will talk about the needs of young adult readers, and then we'll look at some of the books that meet those needs. That's it. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the comments. I look forward to reading what you guys have to say.